Hello, students. This is Mrs. Rodriguez. So this Google Meet is for biology, and today should be Wednesday, September 1st. Today we are starting a new topic. I'm going to go ahead and just read the TEK out loud for today. So today we are covering 7A. We are analyzing and evaluating how evidence of common ancestry among groups is provided by the fossil record, biogeography, and homologies that include anatomical, molecular, and developmental homologies. We are also going to cover 7B, which examines scientific explanations of abrupt appearance, such as stasis in the fossil record. So those are our TEKs for today. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the notes here called Origins of Life. Let me go ahead and just make this a little bit bigger for us so we can see it better. There we go. So we're going to start here with origins of life first. So this is how life started on Earth. So you may hear things like Miller-Urey. That's the experiment that those two scientists did in order to recreate Earth's early atmosphere. And some of those things that popped up from their experiment was something called biomolecules. So if you actually break up the word, guys, this means life. Okay, so bio means life. So biology is actually the study of life. So these are molecules of life if you actually break up the word. So they're pretty important. So it also gives us a little definition. So it tells us here that these are molecules that are made by living organisms like us, for example. And of course, they are very important or critical to life. So these biomolecules, guys, sometimes are also called macromolecules. So these are going to help us make our DNA, which for short is deoxyribonucleic acid, just FYI for your information. So some of those macromolecules or biomolecules that came out of that experiment from Miller and Urey included proteins, okay? And proteins, some of us know, are helpful in muscle development, okay, among other things. They also help, for example, cell membranes, that's part of our cells. The origins of biomolecules, like I said, it comes from the experiment Miller-Urey. This was conducted or done in 1953. So these are Stanley Miller and Harold Urey. That's the name of those scientists that did that experiment to recreate Earth's early atmosphere. And this thing over here, this is a little setup or apparatus, as they call it, on how they recreated Earth's early atmosphere. So the way it works really quick that I'm going to show you here on the right where my cross or cursor is, it starts over here at the bottom where it says water or ocean. So this would be step one. Okay. So this is supposed to recreate the ocean, and it is being heated up by the heat source here. So what happens is that the water vapors travel up through this little tube through the direction of the water vapor circulation. Okay. It's going to go through this tube, and then it's going to go down to this circular flask here, and it's going to be exposed to an electrical spark that's supposed to recreate like lightning, okay, in the atmosphere. And it's going to join together with these gases, which are supposed to be part of the primitive atmosphere or the atmosphere that they thought Earth had before. So once these come into contact with one another, they're going to go through this little condenser here, and then it's going to be exposed to cool water. So at the very end, like around this area right here, guys, this is where those biomolecules are supposed to be being made. So one of the things that these two scientists, such as Miller and Urey, noticed is that what was made here was something called amino acids. Now, that is critical in building proteins. So that is where we found out where biomolecules came from. Okay. So then it would just repeat the process, go through the trap here, and then it would start all over again with your heat source, with your water that's supposed to recreate the ocean, and then repeat. Okay. So that is a little apparatus and the experiment that Miller and Urey recreated. Let's keep going right here. Evolution of cells. We have something called the bubble theory that you can Google on your own. So they had coacertives. These are bubble-like structures that were composed of lipids, also known as fats, which are pictured right here next to you. So these form hollow spheres in the water due to their hydrophobic properties. In other words, they don't like water. So If they're hydrophobic, that means they do not like water. If it's opposite, that would be high. If they're water loving, it would be another term that we're going to introduce to you later on. So another important part of the origin of life, or how life started, is our eukaryotic cells. So if you don't remember, guys, remember that eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus, and it explains here something called the endosymbiotic theory, which is pictured over here in this little model on how those eukaryotic cells develop from this theory. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here. I'm not going to go too much into detail. The other videos that we're going to be presenting to you will explain more on the endosymbiotic theory and other information that is important. Okay. I'm going to switch over to some other notes here. This is called the history of life. So this directly goes with the TEAC 7A. So we are looking at how we have different types of evidences of evolution and common ancestry. All right, so here we have the word common ancestor. So this is usually a species, guys, usually extinct. It's already dead, right? From which a group or all of life is descended from. So it's the first one that was to be developed, right? And they started kind of like that family line of whatever organism that you're talking about. So here on the right, they give you this little tree here, all right? And they're saying that one of the first forms of life here are bacteria, or they thought that it was bacteria. Then it followed something with something called archaebacteria. Then they believe plants were next, fungi, protozoans, which kind of look like worms, right? Then we had little organisms like starfish, then your fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and then mammals. We would be right here next to the rabbit, okay? So this is kind of like the order that scientists believed on how life started, okay? So we evolved or changed over time slowly to become more complex organisms, okay? So we started very simple, like with the bacteria, and then we went all the way to the more complex or more busier type of organisms, such as mammals like us. Down here, we have a little timeline. So it starts where the Earth started forming right here. Let me change the little color here. So the Earth forms at 4.6 billion years, and it goes all the way over here to the right where we're at 4 million years. We finally showed up. They call us early hominids, right? They resembled the way we look right now. Here, they're already walking upright. Before that, they used to walk kind of like primates, like monkeys, right, on all fours. And we also have at 130,000 here, million years ago, modern humans start to evolve right here, guys. So you can see that when you go back to where it says 4.6 billion years ago, when the Earth was barely forming, that's when your precursors of your building blocks of DNA started to develop. And then that's when your bacteria start to form. So that would be in conjunction with this part of this little tree that we just went over right now. Then marine invertebrates became more common, and more fish-like vertebrates evolved. Remember, guys, invertebrate means that it doesn't have a spinal column or a spinal cord, and vertebrates do, okay? Then we start to see more multicellular marine organisms that become more common in the ocean. Remember, marine, aquatic, those are in the water. Arthropods start to move on land, such as this one over here. Then our plants also start to evolve. To remember, plants are also alive, so we start to see more evolution or change over time of plants. We also have our dinosaurs and mammals start to evolve as well. Remember Pangea. Remember, this is that supercontinent. That's when all of the parts of the world were once joined together. That's that supercontinent that I'm referring to. You're probably going to learn that in history if you're taking that history class. So eventually it breaks apart, and that's where we have the continents divide, right? North America, South America, Asia, Africa, and so on, right? But eventually everything gets wiped out at 248 million years, okay? So largest mass extinction removes majority of species, including the dinosaurs, right? And there's several theories on how the dinosaurs got wiped out. Flowering plants then start to evolve. Um, let's see. And then again, another mass extinction. This one actually, sorry, removes the dinosaurs. And then finally, at the end, at 4 million years, we start to see early hominid and we start to walk upright instead of walking on all fours. And then we, as modern humans, evolve. So now going into the fossil record. So remember, guys, that fossils are preserved traces or remains of living organisms from the past. So this is going to show us change in organisms. So notice this example down here, guys. I have, it looks like some type of reptile or dinosaur, right? Right here. Let's call this step 1. And as it goes through the process here, we can see that most of it or some of it is being kind of destroyed by the wear and tear of the atmosphere or the habitat. And finally, we see some humans here recovering those fossils, and we get to learn how the organism was, right, or más o menos, depending on how well those fossils are being preserved throughout the years and how much time passes by, of course. And we also learn about what kind of habitat they had. Another word that we have here, stasis. So this is a period of time where the fossil record shows limited change. In other words, if you compare a fossil, let's say from 4 million years ago, to a fossil that's a little bit more younger in age, let's say you found it, let's say 2 years ago, for example, you can compare and contrast between the older and the newer fossil and see if there was any change. And if there wasn't, you can say that there was some stasis or no change. Okay. So there are some limitations to the fossil record, guys. It's not always perfect. So your fossilization requires specific conditions. In other words, your fossils need to be taken care of. But if they're going to be buried underground for the most part, like these, for example, it's going to go through the wear and tear of the everyday climate. So sometimes it might get preserved good, sometimes it might not. So that's the chance we take with fossils. Also, your organisms, guys, they can appear suddenly in the fossil record. So this is like, for example, an organism that comes out of nowhere. Okay. And if it comes out of nowhere and we don't know a lot of information on it, well, it's going to be a new type of organism. And we're going to kind of have to figure out, let's say from the surrounding fossils, if we find any, to see what kind of habitat it was and figure out what exactly it is, right? If we don't know exactly what it is. Fossil record also has a incomplete fossilization results. So there might be gaps in the fossil record. So we might, let's say we try to make, for example, a timeline to see when it was born, when did it go through like the middle section of living, right? Or when did it die and how did it die? Where did it die? Maybe the fossils moved, right? So there's a lot of possibilities there. Fossils also provide limited conclusions. So we don't have a lot of information on the structure of the organism. Let's say if we find one, and we don't really know the behavior of that organism based on their fossils either. So it's kind of a guessing game, if you will. So your fossil record supports the theory of something called sequential evolutionary change. So what is that? So that's when you have older fossils that are located in the older parts of the strata. Like, for example, if I find fossils down here, guys, they're going to be the older ones. If I find fossils like over here at the top part, they're going to be the younger ones, okay? Like it says, your younger fossils are located in the younger strata or at the top part or the surface of the ground. Okay, so let's go into another evidence of evolution that is called biogeography. Okay, so biogeography is the study of the distribution of species, organisms, and ecosystems through geologic space and time. You're going to see a lot of maps, guys, for biogeography. So, for example, the map down here in like a light blue color, you see how it shows South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, and Australia. So they're saying that these organisms that are pictured, some of them are animals, this one looks kind of like a plant, right? They're saying that all of them have a common ancestor or they're related somehow. You're probably wondering, well, how, right? One of them is in South America, the other one's in, let's say, India, the other one's in Antarctica, okay? So remember what we talked about Pangea, guys? So this relates to biogeography. Remember Pangea had, we before, guys, the continents were not separated, right? For example, these continents down here, they were not separated. Remember, they were in a supercontinent called Pangea. Everybody was all together. So, for example, South America were the neighbors of Africa. Africa was neighbors to India and Antarctica. And then Australia was right next to India and Antarctica. Okay. But remember, once the tectonic plates shifted in Pangea, that's when everything spread out and we had all of the different continents. Okay. But because of Pangea, right, some of our older organisms, like maybe the ones that are pictured below, do have something in common. They're related somehow. So they do have a common ancestor in common. Okay, so it says here, like I told you, Earth's land masses have moved over time, right? Tectonic plates shifted. Remember the mass extinctions that we saw in the little timeline where we saw the history of life, right? A lot of changes happened, a lot of evolution happened. So fossils provide evidence of species that were present across Earth's original landmass, Pangea, right? There's something else called allopatric speciation. This occurred as a landmass split. So, for example, South American and African monkeys share a common ancestor, even though they're from two very different parts of the world. It's all because of Pangea, that supercontinent. The other evidence that we have here are homologies. Okay, so homologies are similar features, like for example, the bones that are shaded in right now. I'll explain what these are, between different organisms that result from common ancestry. So the examples that are showing here, this is called anatomical homology. In other words, like the bones, for example, the structure. So let's look at, okay, so we have a bat, a penguin, human, alligator, and a cat. So notice how they're shaded, guys. Notice how, look, this one is green. That's called that bone number one. This one is also green too, but this is bone number one of the penguin. This is also green, bone number one of the human. This one is also green, bone number one of alligator, and bone number one of the cat. You see that everybody starts with one bone. Okay, and also the bird over here and your bat. Okay, so everybody starts with one bone so far, right? Let's try a different color here. So the following ones, there's two bones, okay? So this one over here with the bat, one is highlighted in orange and blue. So this is one set here. This one over here, there's two bones again, orange and blue. You see there's a pattern. You see that? Orange and blue, orange and blue, orange and blue, orange and blue. And again, we have the two bones, and again right here. Okay, so we follow a pattern here. And then the last one, let's do it purple, are all in pink, right? But we don't call them fingers because not everybody has fingers. We call them digits, guys, okay? So the digits here for the bat, they're pink. The digits of the penguin are also pink. The digits of us, they're also highlighted in pink. These are pink too. This one over here too, pink, pink. You see that? So even though they're very different from one another, right? And they use them, or each organism uses their limbs for different functions, they have that common pattern of bones, guys. That's the homology, okay? That's where we can see that we have some type of relation or some type of common ancestor between all of these organisms, even though they're very different from one another, one, and even though they use them for different functions. What do I mean by that? For example, we don't use our arm to fly like the bat does, right? Or we don't use our arm to swim like, let's say, the alligator does. They're very different, right? So even though that some of us can swim, right, the structure is different, but the pattern is the same. So again, that pattern is going to be one bone, which were all the green ones, right? Two bones, which were the orange and blue ones, and then digits, which is the ones that are highlighted in pink. So again, that's one bone, two bone, digits, right? Those are the homologous structures under homologies. Another type of homology that we have here is called molecular homology. Think DNA, guys, genetic information, genetic code. So these are similar stretches of, there it is, genetic material, DNA, right, between different organisms that result from common ancestry. Example, shared genetic code indicates a common ancestor. We also have something called developmental biology. That's where we have similar features in the embryos. Embryos, guys, are the start of the development, right? Start of a baby, some type of baby or organism, of different organisms that result from common ancestry. Okay. Let's see. Oh, we also have vestigial structure. Almost forgot. So these are structures, guys, that have lost all or most of their functionality through evolution. For example, the whale, guys, has a pelvis that lacks hind limbs. So in other words, whales used to walk, guys, on land. But over time, they didn't really use them because they were mostly in the water. So it's starting to get smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually, poof, it's going to be gone. So an example of a vestigial structure in us would be like the appendix, the tailbone, our wisdom teeth. So those are things that we're born with. We have them, but we don't necessarily have a use for them anymore. We don't use them anymore. Okay. Alrighty, guys. I'm going to show you a quick video now.
Stated clearly present. What is the evidence for evolution? The theory of biological evolution makes two very bold claims about living creatures. First, all living things on Earth are related. They evolved from a common ancestor. Second, the evolution of living things is powered by natural processes, things which can be studied and understood. But is there really any evidence that these two claims are true? Yes. There are so many observable facts from so many different fields of study that the only way we can even begin to talk about them is to group them into categories or lines of evidence. To keep things simple, here we'll focus on evolution's first claim that all living things on Earth are related. We cannot tackle the entire tree of life at once. After all, there's an estimated 8.7 million species alive today. So instead, we'll focus most of our attention on one fairly small but fascinating branch of the evolutionary tree, cetaceans. This branch includes whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Biologists tell us that all these creatures are closely related, and that the entire group evolved from an ancient four-legged land mammal. Instead of taking their word for it, let's look at the facts. We'll start by looking at a few from the field of comparative anatomy, the study of differences and similarities between living things. Whales live in water, and from a distance, they sort of look like giant fish. A close inspection of their anatomy, however, tells us a very different story. Whales, just like land mammals but unlike fish, have placentas and give live birth. They feed milk to their young. They are warm-blooded, which is extremely rare for a fish. And whales do not have gills. Instead, just like us, they breathe air with two fully developed lungs. Whales don't seem to have noses like mammals do. Instead, they breathe through blowholes coming out the tops of their heads. Some whales have two blowholes which almost look like nostrils, but dolphins and porpoises only have one. Surprisingly, if you look at their skulls, you find that the blowhole splits into two nasal passages inside the head. Could it be that the blowhole is actually a highly modified mammal nose? It looks that way, but we'll need more evidence to be sure. Many whales have hair, just like land mammals. In this photograph, you can actually see the whiskers of this baby gray whale as he rests his chin on mama's back. Strangely, whales have arm, wrist, hand, and finger bones inside their front flippers. Here's a photo of these bones, the same bones that bats, hippos, and people have in their front appendages. One bone, two bones, wrist, hand, and finger bones.
Okay, guys, so I just paused here really quick. That is the homologous structures, homologies, right, that I was trying to explain to you here. They perfectly show you, they highlighted them, right? That's the order, one bone, two bone, digits or pieces, right? Remember, those are homologous structures, your homologies.
Modern whales do not have back legs, but they do have a strange pair of bones where the hind legs should be. Here's a picture of these bones from a bowhead whale. They almost look like shriveled hip, thigh, and shin bones. This one even has a ball and socket joint between the hip and thigh bone, just like the ball and socket joint in your own hip. Is this resemblance a mere coincidence, or are these real leg bones? Perhaps leftovers from the whale's evolutionary history? Before we draw any bold conclusions, let's see if a completely separate line of evidence will confirm our suspicions. Embryology is the study of how creatures develop before being born or hatching from an egg. Here we see a dolphin and a human embryo side by side at similar stages of development. Notice that they both have what look like arm buds and leg buds. In humans,
And really quick, guys, this is another type of evidence of evolution. This is called embryology, or sometimes they call it developmental homology. So for the most part, they do call it embryology. So these are pictures, guys, of different embryos or the start of a baby, right? So on the left side, you have your dolphin embryo. That's the start of a baby dolphin. And then on the right side, you have a human, right? A baby. So you can see here, guys, that they're very similar on how we are very similar, on how we develop or start to develop. Remember that dolphins are mammals and we are mammals. So notice how the little head kind of looks very similar to ours. We have that little, it kind of looks like a little humpback or hunchback, I'm sorry. So we have that as well. We have the little arm bud, the little leg bud, and that little tail towards the end. So even though they're not exactly the same, they're very similar when we compare both embryos. Okay, so that would be embryology, and that is another evidence for evolution.
the leg buds grow to become legs. In whales, they grow for a while but then stop, effectively fading away as the rest of the whale continues to grow. These are all photographs of a common dolphin at different stages of growth. Notice that early on, we see two nostril grooves on the front of the face, just like you'd expect in a puppy or a human. As the dolphin continues to grow, the nostrils migrate to the top of the head and fuse together, becoming the dolphin's blowhole. So far, we have multiple facts from two independent lines of study, comparative anatomy and embryology, that are both telling us the same story. The ancestors of whales were once four-legged land creatures. Will the fossil record act as a third witness, confirming this idea?
People with ADHD save 10 hours studying with this Chrome extension. But no, by all means, go ahead.
These are two species of extinct basilosaurid whales. These animals are known for multiple well-preserved skeletons, and they appear to have lived side by side, roughly 34 to 40 million years ago. In this photograph, we're looking down at the top of a basilosaurid skull. This is not a model or a cast, these are the actual bones which were pulled from the ground. Notice that the nasal opening is not on the top of the head like those of modern whales, and not at the end of the snout like those of land mammals. Instead, it's right in the middle. This is an intermediate species, exactly what evolution tells us we should find. At the back end of a basilosaurid's body, there are small, yet fully developed hips, legs, ankle, feet, and toe bones. These legs are far too small for walking on land, but they may have been useful while mating or for scratching away parasites and itchy skin. Evolutionary theory tells us that the further we go back in time, the harder it should be to distinguish whales from normal land mammals. Meet Myocetus. The hip bones of Myocetus seem sturdy enough to walk on land, but this animal is considered to be a whale for many reasons. Their skeletons have all been found among fossils of sea creatures, which tells us they lived in the ocean. Their short legs, combined with long, flat fingers and toes, suggest they were strong swimmers with webbed hands and feet. Here we see the bottom side of a Mycetes jaw and skull. Her teeth match those of the basilosaurid whales we saw earlier, and the unique structures of her middle ear bones match those of basilosaurid whales and modern whales. Mycetes appears to be a walking whale. Scientists have found the fossils of many ancient whale-like mammals and continue to find more. Together, these fossils blur the line between four-legged land mammals and fully aquatic modern whales, solidifying the idea that whales indeed evolved from land creatures. Now let's look at a fourth line of evidence, DNA. DNA molecules contain chemical codes which act like recipes for living things. Without ever looking at bones, embryos, or anatomy, researchers can compare the DNA code of different living creatures to find out who is most closely related to who. Whale DNA has been compared to all kinds of other animals, fish, sea lions, you name it, and so far, the closest genetic match is to the pudgy, water-loving hippopotamus. This does not mean that whales evolved from hippos, but if this genetic finding is correct, whales and hippos both evolved from a common ancestor that lived roughly 54 million years ago. At first, the link between whales and hippos surprised researchers because whales are mainly carnivores. They eat things like fish and small crustaceans. Hippos, on the other hand, are mostly vegetarian. A closer look, however, reveals that hippos and whales actually share many strange features, some of which may have come from their common ancestor. Ancient walking whales have specially shaped ankle bones found only in hippos and the close relatives of hippos. Just like whales, hippos are known to give birth and even nurse their young underwater. They both have multi-chambered stomachs, which is common for herbivores but is almost unheard of for meat-eating mammals. They are both missing a coat of fur, and here's a fun fact. Whales and hippos are among the only mammals on Earth that have internal testicles.
So really quick, guys. So they are comparing whales and hippos, and they think they have a common ancestor, right? So you can almost say that this is also part of some of the evidence of evolution called biogeography, right? Remember, they might have been joined together by the supercontinent called Pangea. So this is a possibility that they do have a common ancestor or some type of relation to each other, maybe through biogeography and also Pangea.
So there you have it. 4 independent lines of evidence all tell us the exact same story. Whales evolved from 4-legged land mammals. But the history of whales is not the only evolutionary history that we've been able to work out. We know from fossils, DNA, embryology, and many other lines of evidence that bird wings are actually modified arms and claws. Birds evolved from dinosaur-like ancestors. We can also clearly see that bat wings evolved from 5-fingered hands very similar to those of monkeys and shrews. We've found that humans share a fairly recent common ancestor with chimpanzees, that mammals evolved from reptile-like creatures, those reptile-like creatures evolved from amphibian-like creatures, those amphibian-like creatures evolved from fish-like creatures, and fish, if you go back far enough, share a common ancestor with segmented worms. So to sum things up, thousands of observable facts.
Okay, we'll stop there on that video. And we're going to go ahead and go over to scientific minds, evidence of common ancestry. So this is just going to kind of repeat the information, but in a different type of way or different form. And this is just to wrap up the lesson, guys.
Common ancestry describes how distinct modern life forms share the same ancestor from which they have evolved. The primary evidences of common ancestry include biogeography, homologous structures, embryology, DNA, and protein structures. It was biogeography that first revealed common ancestry to Charles Darwin. He observed how neighboring islands of the Galapagos had similar yet distinct species of finches, revealing that they evolved from a common finch ancestor that had arrived in the past from South America. Homologous structures are body parts that are similar in structure but may perform different functions. An example is the forelimb of a cat, the fin of a whale, and the wing of a bat. Homologous structures are derived from the same body part of a common ancestor.
The bones in the forelimbs of vertebrates are homologous structures. Although they have different functions, the forelimbs share an ancestral 5-digit structure. Plants also have homologous structures. The leaves of plants, such as carnivorous plants, flowers, and cacti, all appear very different. Their basic leaf structure, however, is very similar and indicates descent from a common ancestor. The study of the evolutionary relationship between homologous structures is called comparative anatomy.
Organisms share homologous structures because they inherit their DNA from a common ancestor. The DNA sequences that code for one structure in an ancestor are passed on to the descendant. Thus, the descendant would have that same structure. Mutations to the sequence would lead to the slight and sometimes drastic changes seen in the structure. In contrast, analogous structures are structures that do not show common ancestry, even though they might be superficially similar or have the same function. Whale flippers and shark fins both serve to help in swimming. However, the internal structure is different due to different DNA sequences. Analogous structures occur when different organisms evolve similar adaptations independently.
Comparisons of early embryonic development also provide evidence for common ancestry. Early vertebrate embryos possess pharyngeal arches, which later develop into structures such as glands and ducts in humans or gill slits in fish. Vertebrate embryos appear strikingly similar to one another regardless of species. Developmental similarities reflect descent from a common ancestor.
As evolution continues, some structures are no longer useful in the way that they once were. Vestigial structures are structures that serve little or no useful purpose in an organism. Their presence indicates structural change over time. The hind limbs in whales are examples of vestigial structures.
Other examples of vestigial structures include muscles for wiggling ears and the appendix in humans, hip bones and rudimentary hind limbs in boa constrictors, fingernails on the fins of manatees, and non-functional eyes on blind cavefish.
Evidence for common ancestry also exists on the molecular level of DNA and protein sequences, which are more similar in closely related organisms.
Alrighty, guys, so that is it for today's lesson. Today is Wednesday, September 1st. You will now proceed to your biology teacher's Google Classroom, and you will work on the lesson that pertains to this today's video. I'm sorry. So that should be lesson 18. It should be on ClassCake or some other format. So make sure again to go and to your biology teacher's Google Classroom and do the work that pertains to this video. Have a great day, guys, and we'll see you tomorrow.